My beloved child, stay with me for a moment, because something happened that your soulmate never expected to happen. A phone call came through, and within minutes, their entire attitude changed. They looked at the people around them differently, went completely quiet, and then said something that nobody in that room was prepared to hear. You are not just someone I care about, you are the person I can no longer pretend doesn't matter. But that was only the beginning. The call did not simply bring news, it forced your soulmate to face a truth they had been avoiding for far too long. As this unfolds, clarity will come, and you will understand why they suddenly started distancing themselves from certain people, conversations, and old connections. There was something about that call that made them realize they had been listening to everyone except their own heart. They remembered moments with you they had tried to forget. They remembered your patience, your words, the way you stayed genuine when others expected you to change. And suddenly, one question began repeating in their mind: what if I lose the one person who was actually real with me? That question changed everything. They did not make their decision because someone forced them. They made it because something inside them finally became clear. They realized that keeping every connection just to avoid disappointing people was costing them something far more valuable. And then came the sentence that shocked everyone: I know who I need in my life now. Stay with me for a moment, because the identity of that person is where this story takes its most emotional turn. Your soulmate did not immediately tell you what happened. Instead, they carried the weight of that conversation silently. They may have appeared normal afterward, but inside, something had shifted. They began replaying the phone call again and again. Someone had asked them about you, perhaps casually at first, but the question touched a place they had been protecting. They were asked why they kept thinking about you, why your name still affected them, and why they had never completely moved forward. Your soulmate tried to give an ordinary answer, but eventually the truth slipped out. Because they understand me in a way nobody else does. That sentence changed the atmosphere. Suddenly, they could see the difference between people who simply wanted access to their life and the person who genuinely cared about their heart. They realized some connections were built on expectations, while what they felt for you was built on something much deeper. Something huge is waiting for you, and it is not simply an emotional confession. It is the realization your soulmate reached after looking at their entire life from a completely different perspective. They understood that sometimes you can be surrounded by people and still feel completely misunderstood. And sometimes one person can be far away yet remain closer to your heart than everyone standing beside you. That realization made them brave enough to make a decision. They started closing doors, not out of anger, not out of bitterness, but because they finally wanted space for what truly mattered. And somewhere in that quiet moment, they said your name. Not casually. Not as a passing thought. They said it with emotion, because they knew the next chapter of their life could not be built on pretending. But there is one detail about that phone call that makes this story even more surprising. Your soulmate was not simply told something about you, they were confronted with something they had been refusing to admit about themselves. Someone on that call reminded them of the person they used to be, the choices they had made, and the opportunities they had allowed to pass by. Then came the question: if you already know who matters to you, why are you still acting like you have no choice? Your soulmate became silent. They had no easy answer. Because deep down, they knew the answer was you. They knew they had been delaying a decision because they were afraid of changing everything around them. They were afraid people would misunderstand. They were afraid their choice would disappoint someone. They were afraid that if they finally admitted how deeply they felt, there would be no way to return to the old version of their life. And then something extraordinary happened. Instead of defending themselves, they simply said, "You are the reason I finally have to be honest with myself." Those words carried more meaning than anyone realized. Your soulmate had reached a turning point. They no longer wanted to live according to everyone else's expectations. They wanted authenticity. They wanted peace. They wanted a connection where they could be themselves without constantly explaining their heart. And that is why the sudden ending of those old ties matters so much. It was not about choosing you against the world. It was about finally choosing truth over confusion. This may resonate as we continue, because sometimes the biggest change happens silently before anyone else can see it. And now comes the part your soulmate has been struggling to say out loud. After the call ended, they looked at their phone for several moments, almost as if they were waiting for your name to appear. They opened your conversation, read old messages, and remembered moments they had dismissed as ordinary at the time. One memory suddenly felt completely different. They realized you had been giving them something they did not recognize until it was almost gone: genuine understanding. Their eyes filled with emotion, and they whispered to themselves, "I should have understood this sooner." That was the moment the decision became real. They knew they could no longer keep pretending that every connection deserved the same place in their life. They knew some relationships had already completed their purpose, while the connection with you still carried an unfinished story. So when they said, "You are," they were not searching for a simple label. They were trying to describe something much bigger: "You are the person who made me see myself differently." And that realization is what the phone call truly changed. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that your presence was never random in their emotional journey. You challenged them to grow without demanding that they become someone else. You gave them space while still caring. You stayed memorable even during silence. And now they are looking at everything differently. Something huge is waiting for you, but the greatest revelation may be that your soulmate is no longer asking, "Should I choose this connection?" They are asking, "How do I finally become honest enough to stop running from it?" The moment your soulmate made that decision, something inside them became unusually calm. Not because everything was suddenly solved, but because they finally stopped fighting what they already knew. My beloved child, there was one thought they could not escape. If I keep choosing everyone else's expectations, I may lose the one connection I actually wanted to protect. That realization made them look back at every conversation, every delay, every moment when they almost reached out to you and then stopped themselves. They remembered how many times they had typed something, stared at your name, and deleted it. They remembered the questions they never asked and the feelings they never explained. And then the phone call came back to their mind. Someone had asked them directly, "Who is the person you would regret losing?" They did not answer immediately. Their silence answered for them. It was you. That was the moment they understood why they had been unable to completely disconnect emotionally, even when they tried to move forward. The people around them had noticed the change too. Your soulmate was no longer participating in the same conversations, no longer explaining themselves, and no longer trying to keep everyone satisfied. They had reached a point where peace mattered more than approval. Stay with me for a moment, because what happened next reveals why they ended those old ties so suddenly. They were not simply walking away from people. They were walking away from an old version of themselves, the version that constantly ignored their own heart just to keep everything comfortable. Then came the conversation nobody expected. One person asked your soulmate, "Is this really because of them?" Your soulmate could have denied it. They could have changed the subject. They could have pretended they had moved on. Instead, they paused and gave an answer that completely changed the atmosphere: "Yes. Because they made me realize what I actually want." That sentence carried years of hidden emotion behind it. Your soulmate finally understood that the connection with you had affected them in ways they could not explain logically. You had become part of their thoughts during quiet mornings, late evenings, ordinary moments, and unexpected memories. Even when they were surrounded by people, something about you remained in the background of their heart. And now they were tired of pretending that did not matter. As this unfolds, clarity will come, because the biggest revelation is not that they ended certain connections, it is why they felt they had to. They realized that some people only knew the version of them that existed before they understood what they wanted. Those people expected them to remain predictable. But your soulmate was changing. They wanted fewer conversations with no meaning and more moments that felt genuine. They wanted to stop explaining every decision. Most importantly, they wanted to become honest about the person who had touched their heart in a way nobody else could replace. That person was you. And somewhere deep inside, your soulmate knew that if they wanted any real future with you, they first had to create emotional space for it. Now listen carefully, because this is where the story becomes personal. Your soulmate did not just remember your face or your voice. They remembered the feeling of being understood by you. They remembered a moment when you could have judged them but chose patience instead. They remembered something you said that seemed small at the time but stayed with them for much longer than expected. That memory became the emotional turning point. They realized that while other people had been trying to tell them what they should feel, you had allowed them to discover their own feelings. That difference became impossible to ignore. Your soulmate began thinking, maybe I have been looking for peace in the wrong places. And that thought changed the way they viewed their relationships. They started questioning everything they had accepted simply because it was familiar. They started asking themselves whether certain connections were truly meaningful or whether they were simply afraid to let them go. Then they remembered you again. They remembered the unfinished conversations. The unanswered questions. The strange feeling that something between you had never received its proper ending. That feeling became stronger than their hesitation. And this is the part you should remember. Sometimes a person does not realize the value of a connection while they are surrounded by noise. They recognize it when the noise becomes quiet. Your soulmate is entering that quiet moment now. They are beginning to see that what they felt for you was never as temporary as they tried to make it seem. Something huge is waiting for you, and the surprising part is that your soulmate may finally be preparing to communicate what they have kept hidden for far too long. Before we continue, if this message is resonating with you, take a moment to share it with someone who may need to hear these words, and subscribe so you do not miss the next part of this unfolding story. Because what your soulmate decided after that phone call was only the beginning. They did not end those connections just to create distance from the past. They created space because they wanted to understand what the future could look like. And when they finally had that quiet space, one thought became stronger than every other thought: I need to talk to them. They knew a simple message would not be enough. They knew they could not casually appear and pretend nothing had changed. There were things they needed to explain. There were emotions they needed to acknowledge. There were moments when they had misunderstood you, and moments when they had allowed outside opinions to influence their choices. Now they were ready to admit that. Your soulmate looked at your name again, and this time they did not close the conversation. They stayed there. They started writing. Then they stopped. They wrote again. And this time, instead of asking what everyone else would think, they asked themselves one final question. What would I say if I knew I could never hide my truth again? The answer was simple, emotional, and impossible to ignore. You are the person I should have been honest with from the beginning. And that is where the next revelation begins, because the message they are preparing to send may explain exactly why that phone call changed everything. The message was almost ready, but your soulmate could not press send. Another conversation began, and this time they were asked directly, if you could change one thing about the past, what would it be? They remained silent for several seconds. Then they said, would have trusted my own heart sooner. Those words revealed everything. They finally understood how much time had been spent trying to make sense of other people's opinions while ignoring their own feelings. Your soulmate realized that every time they allowed someone else to define what your connection meant, they became more confused. But every time they listened quietly to themselves, the answer remained the same: you mattered. As this unfolds, clarity will come, because your soulmate is beginning to recognize a pattern they never noticed before. Whenever life became overwhelming, they thought of you. Whenever something beautiful happened, they wondered what you would say. Whenever they felt misunderstood, they remembered the way you had listened. And whenever they tried to imagine their future without your presence, something inside them felt incomplete. They could not explain why. They simply knew. That realization was powerful enough to make them reconsider every decision they had made recently. They started understanding that some people enter our lives and leave memories, while a rare connection changes the way we understand ourselves. To your soulmate, you became that rare connection. And now, after the phone call, they were no longer interested in convincing anyone else. They only wanted to know whether you still had room in your heart for the truth they were finally ready to share. But there was one final piece of the story they had not told anyone. During that phone call, someone mentioned a moment involving you that your soulmate had completely misunderstood. Suddenly, everything connected. A situation they once viewed as rejection began to look completely different. A silence they once interpreted as distance began to feel like patience. A decision they thought meant you no longer cared began to look like something you did because you respected their space. Your soulmate sat quietly as this realization settled in. They whispered, "So they were never against me." And that sentence carried an enormous emotional weight. They understood that perhaps both of you had been waiting for clarity while neither wanted to make the first move. They had been interpreting silence, while you may have been protecting your own peace. They had been wondering whether you still cared, while you may have been wondering whether they ever truly understood you. Suddenly, the distance between you no longer looked like an ending. It looked like a chapter that had never been properly explained. That was the revelation that changed your soulmate's heart. They realized they had been searching for answers everywhere except in the one place where the truth had been quietly waiting, in the connection they shared with you. Something huge is waiting for you, because the decision they made after this realization was not temporary. They decided that if they were given another opportunity to speak with you, they would not waste it pretending to be unaffected. And then came the moment that could change everything. Your soulmate opened your conversation again. This time, they did not type a casual greeting. They wrote the truth they had been carrying: "You are the person I never stopped caring about." They read it several times. Their heart raced, their thoughts became quiet, and for the first time, they understood that honesty did not require a perfect speech. It required courage. So they continued, "I ended certain connections because I finally realized I cannot build a meaningful future while constantly allowing other people to decide what my heart should feel." That was the message they had been trying to write all along. They wanted you to know that the phone call had not made them suddenly care about you. It simply forced them to recognize what had already been there. They wanted you to know that their silence was never proof that you were forgotten. Their hesitation was never proof that you were unimportant. And their distance was never the full story. There was a much deeper struggle happening inside them. Now they were ready to explain it. They were ready to tell you what they had never been able to say clearly before. But just as they were about to send the message, they noticed something that made them stop once again. Something connected to your past conversation appeared on their screen, and suddenly, another truth came rushing back. That final memory may explain why they are not simply trying to reconnect with you. They are preparing to tell you exactly what they wish they had said the very first time they realized you were special.